Mountains are both dominant and daunting, challenging and a sign of stability. They are a place of mystery as well as revelation, and they are a place of worship. St. Louis University professor Belden Lane describes mountain landscapes in the Old and New Testaments theologically as apophatic and cataphatic. The Old Testament is apophatic, a negative theology that describes God by what God is not, as opposed to who God is, since we can't ever really describe God. The New Testament is cataphatic, with positive statements about the nature of God according to what God has revealed about God's own self in Scripture and in nature. Typically, in the Old Testament, God is most frequently connected with Mount Sinai. Belden notes Sinai is a mountain of the imagination, an evocative image of great power that recurs repeatedly in the Christian apophatic tradition. A symbol of fierce majesty, a landscape of terror as theophany, where Yahweh is met in the darkness of unknowing. God is at the mountain, and it is typically shrouded in clouds and dark. It is God's self-disclosure to the Israelites that they are being shaped as God's people. This morning's scripture has a theophany, and it's bracketed by them. The Israelites have arrived at Sinai, and Moses is called to go up to God. Already we see that grace comes first. God has not only rescued the Israelites from slavery, but they are to be God's treasured people. And all God asks in return is that they keep covenant with God. Moses will return and explain to the people what God has said and consecrate them. And then they washed their garments and prepared to meet God, which is what happens in this morning's reading. And indeed, of course, God appears in thunder and smoke. This place where God appears is the true beginning of their journey to become God's people. The commandments they will soon receive outline the basic tenets of living together in community, faithfully, not just as any collection of people, but as the people of God. In the Gospels, significant events in Jesus' ministry also occur at the mountains. The Transfiguration, the Sermon on the Mount, the betrayal on the slopes of Gethsemane, the ascension at the Mount of Olives. The landscape here, though, is less fierce. The events mostly take place in the light of day and with Jesus' physical presence. Jesus' transfiguration, believed to have been at Mount Tabor, is a very different theophany than the one in Exodus, where God is inaccessible and more elusive. Here, God is made manifest in the person of Jesus, who is bathed in light, not clouds and thunder. In the presence of Moses and Elijah, God behind a cloud announces, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." It is a sign of what will come and of God's continued faithfulness. It's a new beginning and a renewal of community. Sometimes the mountains are a metaphor. God continues to meet us, present in the everydayness of life and in worship and in times of celebration. And perhaps more importantly, God is present in times of violence, trauma, and great sorrow. As the people of God, we are called into community. As Christians, we are called to live out our faith actively, continuing Jesus' ministry. Those times when we meet God at the mountaintop, sustain and strengthen us for that work, and to take God's message out of this sanctuary and into the streets. With 3 more shootings this week, I'm sure you've experienced the same range of emotions I've felt: shock, grief, disbelief, anger. As the church, our immediate inclination is to pray. And prayer is important, but I'm sorry, it's not enough. We have to recognize that most of us in this sanctuary have power simply by the virtue of the color of our skin. I am well aware that I do not have to have the conversation with my son about how to dress, how to act, how to respond to a police officer if he's pulled over, that Black mothers must have with their sons. Even understanding that, we still don't get it. In a blog post, writer John Mehta wrote, "To understand, you have to know that Black people think in terms of Black people. We don't see a shooting of an innocent Black child in another state as something separate from us because we know viscerally that it could be our child, our parent, or us that is shot." We have to try to understand racism. In his essay, Mehta notes that racism is not just slavery, white water fountains, or the back of the bus. He says racism is more subtle than that. It's more nuanced. Racism is the fact that white means normal, and that anything else is different. Racism is our acceptance of an all-white Lord of the Rings because of historical accuracy, ignoring the fact that it is a world of entirely fictionalized history. We have to train ourselves to recognize racism in all its forms and to use the power we have to call out racism wherever we see it, hear it, encounter it. We must stand up with and for our brothers and sisters. We have to be present and acknowledge the pain and the fear and grief of those in the Black community over numerous police killings where there are rarely indictments or convictions. We have to have meaningful conversations about violence and this country's idolatry of guns. The day of the Orlando massacre, there were 42 other shootings in that day alone. The Washington Post has maintained a database of fatal shootings by police since 2015. There is already a 6% increase since this time last year. And Blacks continue to be shot at 2.5 times the rate of whites. We should be just as angry over the targeted shootings of the Dallas police officers. In an article this morning, the Washington Post notes that Dallas has a long history of brutality against minorities. But over the last 2 decades, the city has worked diligently to transform the department. It is arguably one of the best against its peers of similar size. Civil rights activists, national police leaders, and Dallas officials say that the department is a model of the reforms sought by the Black Lives Matter movement since a white officer shot and killed a teenager in Ferguson in August 2014. We have to stand on a higher ground, guided by our faith and who it is we are called to be. There are those who are itching for a new race war in Dallas. But the city's white mayor and black police chief are presenting a united front. Chief David Brown said, "This must stop, this divisiveness between our police and our citizens." Mayor Mike Rawlings urged the city and the nation to come together and lock arms and heal the wounds we all feel. We have to realize that this is a systemic problem, and it would be wrong to simply divide into pro-cop or pro-black camps. I would commend, as an aside, Trevor Noah, who's the host of the Comedy Central's The Daily Show's monologue from Thursday night. It's worth the 7.5 minutes of your time to watch it. We can't fall back simply on all lives matter, because if any life or any group of people are devalued, no lives matter. It would also be wrong to assume that everything that appears in the myriad of social media and other websites are vetted sources. NPR correspondent Sam Sanders, who is black, reporting from Dallas, noted that he saw the Dallas police officers of all colors comforting people all over Dallas, noting that there is a unity in the city that is not mirrored online. And friends, these messages of unity, they're the seeds of hope. There can be change. God meets us not only at the mountain, but where we are. My faith is grounded in the trust that our God, who loved us so deeply, who sent God's only Son to be among us, to teach, to heal, even to die for us, gives us hope in the promise of the resurrection. Our God calls us to live out our faith, serving as agents of healing, planting those seeds of hope, supporting our brothers and sisters. We have to work for reconciliation, forgiveness, and love. God is present in our lament, our anger, and our injustice, and fueling our conviction to fight for justice and equality for all of God's children. And may God grant us the courage to do so. Amen.